Ecstatic Bliss. Secrets to living a juicy life. Ego versus soul. This is often how people see it in the world of spirituality. It's either the ego or the soul. So a very black and white approach to thinking that the ego is evil and that we have to erase it completely on our path to awakening, ascension, liberation, and eventually in some lifetime to enlightenment. And while this is one valid perspective in some way, I would love to invite you to see the ego a little bit more nuanced, not in this black and white, but to recognize that the ego has different flavors and that the ego, of course, is also something in this game of life that helps us identifying with something and therefore having a human experience, an identity that feels separate from everything so that we can remember everything. And if you have a look back in the history of my podcast episodes, you will also find one episode about befriending the ego. So maybe you want to also listen to that episode if you're in a phase of, I don't know about this ego. Sometimes it's bothering me, sometimes it's helping me. And to find a balance between those extremes. Because, as mentioned, the ego gives us the illusion of a separate self, an identity, and to operate as this human being on this planet, so it has a valid function as well. So let us look at the different flavors I at least distinguish in the sphere of ego. Of course, there are many more nuances or flavors to it, but these are the 4 main flavors I can decipher when we want to categorize it or put it in a framework so our mind can understand the ego a little bit better. Because actually everything that we name, title, label, or give a concept to is just something for our human mind to understand it better and then to drop it again so we can actually also feel what is true for ourselves in our particular unique life. And you will also notice that these flavors in a way are an evolution. So in one lifetime we start with one and then we evolve through the different flavors to refine actually the ego. To transition from a very dense and very, very separate ego to a more lighter version, maybe even divine version, if you can call it like this, that is integrated and so much more dancing with the soul, so that it becomes from ego versus soul, more a ego and soul, or ego in service to the soul. The first flavor we have is the toxic ego. And that is basically for a lot to understand under the terminology of narcissism. Me, myself, and I. Totally separate, totally just focused on one's own benefits and needs. Not really taking care of others, even seeing others more as objects to gain something from, to even manipulate, to take advantage of for one's own benefits. Lots of self-obsession, needing validation from outside, wanting to be center of attention. The whole universe is surrounding oneself. That's the toxic version of the ego. And in a way also something we can see as someone has totally forgotten about their true nature, which is we are interconnected with everyone, or from an even higher perspective, we are everything and everyone. I mean, the other one is you yourself. So treat the other as yourself because it's eventually you in another body. But a toxic ego, narcissism, is when someone has completely forgotten that truth and is completely immersed in this illusion of it's just me and the whole life surrounds around me, which is in a way true, yeah, main character energy, I'm also often mentioning, but it's a toxic way of really not caring a shit about others. And if we see it from a soul perspective, as I always like to see the world, this toxic ego mechanism gives really a soul the immersion into I'm a separate self. And all these others are enemies. And I have to protect myself. I'm in survival mode. Everyone is wanting something from me, actually. Or I can use someone so I gain my benefit. It's a very egoistic, narcissistic way of journeying through life, but from a higher perspective, if you've journeyed with me for a longer time, you know there's no judgment from that higher perspective. That's a valid exploration of life, we can say. And maybe one lifetime, the very first lifetime even, every one of us was in this toxic ego. And sometimes maybe also we find ourselves dipping into the toxicity of the ego when we are in certain situations or in certain circumstances with certain people and certain environments. Sometimes this may sneak in a more toxic version of the ego. Very, very unconscious, of course, of oneself. Then the next nuance, the next flavor, which is a bit more refined, a bit more conscious, but still very like this is me and this is my identity and I have to protect that identity, is the wounded ego. The wounded ego arises or is formed by karma due to past experiences. Usually so that we don't get hurt again. Through hurt, wounds arise, heart contraction happens, and then the ego comes and says, I have to protect myself from others, otherwise I get hurt again, and that I don't want. The wounded ego is also connected with two mechanisms. First, the survival mechanism, something very intrinsically in all of us, biologically even, I would say. Fight, flight, freeze. In the extreme, it gets into control, the control of life, of the path, of plans, of others. And the second mechanism are defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are, for example, justification, explanation or over-explanation, needing to have the last word, projection, ignorance, gaslighting, blaming, sabotaging, numbing, distraction, addictions, obsessions, binges, all of this. And I can imagine all of us see ourselves in some of these mechanisms that are defense mechanisms to stand in one's own truth or to defend one's own truth, one's own identity. Also, actually, some defense mechanisms may sound a little bit more pleasant, which are people-pleasing, overgiving, caretaking, and I can do everything alone. Just to mention here also, it's just not only like the more shadow sides, but also the other side of, from the outside it may look or feel very lightful, like doing favors for others or always being there for others or I can handle it myself kind of way. But it can also be a defense mechanism, not to get hurt, not to get someone too close, and eventually not to be vulnerable and therefore not to have the openness to get attacked. As you can see, the wounded ego is mainly there to protect oneself, to create a perceived sense at least of safety for the individual, for the identity, for one's own truth, for one's own perceived reality, the illusion of reality, to keep that alive. It is, however, often based on distorted beliefs, assumptions, and generalizations. So whenever you catch yourself or someone saying something like always, never, ever, a little bit in this dipping into this victim mentality or of this is like it is and there's no other way of how it could be. Very rigid view of life or one's own perception of life or like the perception also of oneself. Very rigid view That's a defense of the ego to keep oneself in the very same reality one is currently in. A little bit also like protecting the comfort zone of one's own reality. To get out of this wounded ego, which a lot of people I feel are in, the unconscious needs to become conscious. It requires self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-observation. To notice these patterns, like when do you go to fight, flight, freeze? When do you tend to justify yourself or please others or sabotage something or distract yourself or even fall into addictions, obsessions? Yeah, to catch yourself in these moments, in these patterns and habits, which is not always easy because it needs this self-awareness and this honesty with yourself. And then to stop, reflect, and see, which situations trigger that, and where, going back in your history of your evolution in past experiences, where did something happen where the first time, or where maybe repetitively something happened and where you develop this coping mechanism, because defense mechanisms are often also coping mechanisms to keep yourself safe and intact and in your truth. Where this happened for the first time and why you applied that and how it still nowadays helps you in a way, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. Our system is smart. So if you still do it, it's a learned pattern, and maybe also, most probably, it still gives you some advantage or some benefit. And then to see where is the root cause of this pattern, this mechanism. And why do I think I have to defend myself? What am I protecting? What is safety anyways? Yeah, we can also ask. And what are healthier versions of the ego that I can still keep my perceived sense of safety for the nervous system, but stay with an open heart? Because most defense mechanisms, survival mechanisms, close the heart, which is of course understandable. But if we want to journey with an open heart and loving way through life, we need to find a balance between overly protecting ourselves and staying in our heart, opening our heart, or better so, to have some practice, especially spiritual practice of reading yourself, of having a protection mantra, for example, to always be with an open, vibrant, radiant heart and still feel safe, because you feel like, I have an energy around me that protects me, or I have my spirit guides, my guardians, whoever you call in, to protect me. Because we need more people with an open heart, of course. Yes, so this is a journey. The wounded ego is in all of us because it's related to survival. And survival, if we don't feel safe, if we're in survival mode, we are always in a way ready for attack. Ready to, this is just me and it's important to be safe and it is important. I'm the most important person right now. Yeah, it's a little bit of first I protect myself, then others. And if the safety is not there inside of you or cultivated even inside of you, you will always have a little bit of this wounded ego. From this second flavor, the wounded ego, we transition to the healed ego. The more we reflect ourselves, the more we look at our patterns, our triggers that trigger these patterns, the more we heal our own heart, the more we get rooted, grounded in our self-love, the more we can find a healed version of the ego. That means there's a balance between this is me, this is you, but we are also one. To have both your individuality and empathy for others. That you have a healthy self-protection due to self-love, not abandoning yourself for others, not overgiving, people-pleasing and so forth. But that you also can be in service for others. The ability to be discerning when to tap more into having the discernment in situations when it is more a situation of this is about me, myself, and I right now, and I need to set boundaries. And when it is time, a situation with someone where you can really truly be open and vulnerable and share from your heart. A healed ego gives us the ability to switch between the I and the you, the me and others, and still see at some later stage, we are both one, we are here together in this. And whatever I do to myself, I do to you. And whatever I do to you, I do to myself. To have this amount of reflection, that's an evolution within the healed version of ego, I would say. From a conscious ego to an even more conscious ego. What we also can categorize here in this healed ego is the conscious play with identities. I've also already podcast episodes about identity shifting, conscious identity shifting. So if you feel that's calling you, then go ahead and search for identity shifting or playing with identities, because this comes here in the healed version of the ego. Because ego is always, there's an identity. When ego is in place, there's an identity, there's a labeling intact, there's something like I am this and that. But if it's healed, if it's more conscious, you are aware that you can play with your identities. That you can label yourself as you want. This comes also down to the manifestation process of I can choose who I want to be. And here, in my opinion, the ego and the soul dance in interaction. So before we had more, this is more the ego, dominance of ego in life. The soul maybe not even known or ridiculed from some, especially the toxic version. I mean, some people don't even know the terminology of soul. And here in the healed nuance, in the healed flavor of the ego, we have the ego and soul in harmonic dance at some point, where the soul uses the ego to consciously shift reality by shifting identity. It's like, I want to explore life from this perspective, and for this I need this identity, so I shape my ego in this way, or I use this ego to form this identity. Maybe in that way also the line between ego and identity blurs at some point, where the ego becomes not put in a dark corner, but more so in the light of ego equals more or less identity. We can see it in that way in the healed version. And then the soul actually is quite grateful to have an ego, because then it can play, it can experience, it can explore and see different versions of what life is about, what this all is about, the roles and masks you can play consciously. In the wounded version, it's more unconsciously, it's conditioned, it's based on past experiences, on false belief system, of distortions. But here in the healed version, at some point, the ego becomes an ally, not an enemy. And for the most advanced healed version of the ego, I would say, we have oneness consciousness whilst being in that separate identity. Because we need an identity, again here, just as a reminder, we need an identity to function in this human society. Otherwise, people can misuse you because you don't have any boundaries. You feel like, everything is light and everything is me and, But if others are not on the same level of consciousness as you are, like oneness consciousness, it's easy to get overstepped. And therefore we need boundaries, and boundaries again mean you have an identity, you have a separation in a way in place, a framework, how others can treat you or are allowed to treat you. But the advanced version of a healed ego is you have the awareness, you have the consciousness of we are all one. I know that this other person is me in another body. This person looking at me is me actually looking at myself. And still you can journey through life in your own separate self. And then it becomes, for some, in some lifetime, an exploration of how far do I go in this oneness consciousness, and how far do I go back into my own individuality. And that play becomes more dominant in some point in this human evolution, because we are more and more journeying towards this. Like, shadow work is a lot working on the level of the wounded ego, and the light work is much more than in the healed version. And then tapping into, okay, we are here to ascend to 5D, so we need to heal these wounds, so we are not tapping into wounded ego or even toxic ego, but we at least interact with each other on a healed level. And then we have the last stage or flavor of the ego. The ego's evolution is, in a way, the ego's dissolution. That the ego has surrendered to the soul. Some may also call it ego death, and also already from the wounded into the healed version we have multiple ego death, because it's usually not just one big death, but multiple ones. It happens in layers, in stages. And then we have the flavor, what I call the divine ego. Yeah, it sounds maybe a little bit paradoxical, but the divine ego is basically the ego that has surrendered to the soul. We can say we already have surrendered the ego a little bit more when we are in the state of oneness consciousness. But in an even more advanced version, there is not this limited I anymore in control, not the identity operating, but you're rather operating from an integrated ego into your whole system, so that you are more operating from soul, from the soul level, and from divine guidance. Like, there is not this I want to manifest, but I know something greater than me is manifesting through me. And that needs a deep surrender of the ego. Not just the surrender of the ego of, okay, we are all one, I have my path, the other have their path, and this is my truth, and there can be multiple truths coexisting, because the toxic and wounded still fight, this is my truth and this is the only truth existing. Healed version is already, I open myself, there are multiple truths existing, because actually the ultimate truth we cannot really fully ever understand from a human mind perspective. But the divine ego has not even it doesn't even want anymore to know the truth. It is just operating, okay, the divine wants to experience this through me, so I submit to divine will. I'm in service to divine will. And that means much more operating from soul than from identity. Or what I sometimes call, because identity, it's a question I'm always repeating. We need an identity to function here in a way, but the soul-based identity at least is very much an approximation, a refinement of identity, approximation to your soul's essence. So that, yet again, the soul is in charge much more than the ego, and the ego is more in submission, in service to the soul and the divine, of course, which is a hierarchy even more higher up. And the extreme form, maybe a last form at some point in some lifetime for enlightenment or to leave this body, there may be this ego version that is totally dissolved, so that you don't have any identity, that you transition into emptiness of not being anything, but merging back into pure existence, pure energy. So everything is dissolved back into the only source that it exists. If we now look at these 4 main flavors that I identify as toxic, wounded, healed, and divine, we see there's an evolution happening throughout lifetimes and within one life, of course, as well. But it is not, when being here as a human being, it is not about fully erasing the ego, which I feel some spiritual concepts indicate or claim that is the purpose you have to do, or with ego death, maybe some associate, okay, after ego death, my ego doesn't exist anymore at all. This is not the case. It's not about fully erasing it, but about, first of all, making it conscious and then using it consciously. to switch between your separate self and the version that is merged with everything. Me and you and oneness. Identity and dissolution of identity. And to play with that, because when you have both perspectives, both sides of this coin, of this one coin, so to say, you understand reality on a much deeper level. There's no goal in it. It's all about exploration and experience. Yeah, and if you have this view of, I have to erase my ego, I have to let go of my ego all the time, then you miss the point that the ego also has a benefit, of course. But it's always about the consciousness that needs to, the awareness that needs to go into that experience. This is my identity, and this is when I'm getting out of my identity. This is how I play with identities, and this is how I drop my identities. This is when I find myself in my wounded, defensive ego identity, and this is when I find myself in the open heart and ego service to the divine will identity. It's a dance, a play, an exploration, and seeing through these opposites, deeper layers of your own true self, of the truth itself, and of this, what this game is all about. From also maybe, I don't know where you are at your journey, but maybe you had or have a phase of, I don't really want to have this ego is bothering me, to befriend it again, to integrate it, first of all to accept it also, then to integrate it as a useful tool on your journey. That it can be an ally to the soul, instead of being always the enemy, the evil in the storyline. That's my main message today, so you can reflect for yourself, what does the ego mean to you at the moment? Where do you stand on your journey with the ego? And ego versus soul, or ego and soul, or ego above or below soul, however, whichever concept currently flows inside of you, to get inspired by these 4 flavors I discussed today, and as always, to enjoy playing with that. Knowing concepts, dissolving concepts again, to see what works for you and what feels true to you and your own soul's path. Much love and bliss, Soraya Ananda. If you feel the deep pull to walk this spiral more intimately, Soulgasm, my 6-month one-on-one sacred mentoring awaits you. This is a living embodiment of all I transmit here, but uniquely decoded for your soul. Enter the portal of ecstatic bliss and unleash your personal soulgasmic reality. All details and the link to book your vibrational match call are in the show notes.